Mortality. It is only when you taste it with the lips of your living body that you finally realize that you are a creature who will die. Ernest Becker. All creatures, big or small, from the tiny ants to the giant whales, oppose death. The desire to live and the great struggle against death is very transparent among animals of all kinds. The fear of death, it can be said therefore, is the basic motivation that drives most creatures. The question then is, can we say the same for the human animal? Because from the looks of it, human beings certainly don't appear as if they are worried all that much about death. This is especially surprising because unlike other creatures, we have highly developed system of language which has equipped us with the ability to think about our future. And unlike most things that we believe will happen to us in future, death is the most certain of them all. Adding insult to injury, this most certain fact of our inevitable demise is also unpredictable. That is, we don't even know when we will die. We may as well die tomorrow or the next minute. Based on these incontrovertible facts, it could be argued that human beings should theoretically be even more worked up about death than simple creatures. Because not only we will die one day, but we can also think about it in advance by the virtue of our active imaginations. But if you look around all the Netflix binging, video game playing, porn watching, and idly gossiping human beings, something doesn't seem quite right. We seem to be living as if we are immune to death, as if we are carrying some golden ticket to immortality. This vast share of mundane and shallow human activity doesn't seem to be in accord with the blunt realization of one's mortality. So what then is happening here? Where have we lost our awareness of death? Or have we even lost it? This is where things get interesting. The thing is that the awareness of death is not really absent, it is merely repressed. In fact, as recent psychological studies have confirmed, most human behavior, just like animals, is driven by the fear of death. In this episode then, we are going to see how we sneakily manage to bury the truth of our mortality. We will see how we have artificially created an impression of life where there is no death, and how we can finally wisen up and learn to accept and embrace it. Once upon a time, a young man on the verge of his death was lying on his bed. "I never thought it would end like this," he said to his doctor. "Then what did you think it would be like?" the doctor asked. The man sighed and said, "I guess I never really thought about it." What about you? Have you, the listener, ever thought about your own mortal nature? Unfortunately, of all the things that we think and talk about, death rarely becomes the subject of our serious contemplations. We knowingly shy away from it. The reason I ask you this question, and in fact the reason I made this episode, is because there is actually a bright side to such an exploration. Throughout the history of mankind, encounters with death have brought radical transformation in people. Even brief confrontations with death have turned lives upside down and wizened people up. The fact of our own death is a blunt reminder of our momentary performance on the theatre of life, a necessary slap that we all need. Without the realization that we are temporary beings, the claim to a life of depth is just a facade, a pretense. It would be foolish, therefore, to not utilize this enormous perspective on life that embracing death provides us. But before we come to that, let's first understand how the prospect of death becomes repressed in the human psyche. There are three major defenses human beings deploy, mostly unconsciously, to hide from the idea of mortality. The most common way in which we collectively deceive ourselves against death is by fancying the mirage of physical comfort. If you're listening to this podcast, it is likely that you're accustomed to comfort. In fact, more and more people in the 21st century take physical comfort for granted. Without a doubt, we are way more materially comfortable than our ancestors. Even if you were a king a few centuries ago, you did not have the luxuries that a middle-class man or woman can afford today. At the click of a button, we can order around electronic devices that work 24/7 in our service. Look, for example, at the poor fan on your ceiling. Its only job is to spin round and round so that your highness don't feel too hot. The thing is that this trend towards comfort is only increasing. More and more technologies are being invented to make our lives more comfortable, more safe, and more secure. The question is, do we really need them? Will more comfort really lead us to a better life? To answer this question, let me raise another one. Why is it that we want to be comfortable in the first place? What are we getting from it? First of all, let me establish that this comfortable world that we have managed to create for ourselves is purely an artificial state of affair. No other creature on the planet lives in such levels of security and comfort. But given the fact that we are at the top of the food chain, why are we, the mighty humans, leaning more and more behind the walls of our home? Shouldn't we live more freely? I was once watching a stray dog who lives near my house when I suddenly realized that I may be living in a small part of this neighborhood, but this dog has the entire neighborhood as his home. The hard truth is, and the reason why we keep leaning more and more towards comfort is because we are afraid. Afraid because in the heart of our hearts, we know that the world beyond the safety of our homes is dangerous. It poses a threat to our life. It is only behind the guise of comfort that it is possible for us to embrace a safer view of the world. Few people want to bite the bullet and live with the awareness that unlike the world of Disney movies, the forces of nature are indifferent to our living or dying, and will not shy away from taking our life the moment we are careless. No matter how popular you are in the human world, for instance, if left alone in the wilderness, you will only be a food to the hungry beasts. Far from being pitiful, the wild creatures will only be delighted in gnawing your body with their sharp canines, feasting on your living flesh, and then ruthlessly leaving the remains for the worms. When they will rest with their bellies full the next day, they will neither regret nor will they remember that they ate you. The truth is that the world, and in fact the universe itself, is hostile and unsafe for us human beings. But we don't want to feel unsafe, and so we hide. We keep hiding all our lives behind the comfort and security of the civilized world, and then tell ourselves and our kids that the world is safe. If you look at the map of the world, for example, you will find that human beings are not spread evenly across the globe. A large share of land is abandoned or scarcely populated, and the majority of human population is concentrated only in the most habitable places on Earth, away from all the wild creatures, the volcanoes, the freezing mountains, and the dry deserts. And this is not a coincidence. Being physically protected from threats to our survival gives us some psychological insulation, however arbitrary, against the idea of death. In the safety of our homes, our secure and civilized neighborhood, our fortified nation, we can finally live in the forgetfulness of death. We can bury the fact of our mortality in the recesses of our consciousness and live like safe individuals in our luxurious self-made prisons that we like to call our homes. The second major way we collectively deny the fact of our mortality is through cultural heroism. Now this defense is less obvious than the first and may sound counterintuitive at first, but it works quite well in quelling our fear of death. The problem is that even though we human beings manage to guard ourselves against the raw forces of nature, but that does not give us complete protection against death, because as fate would have it, our own fellow human beings turn out to be even more potent a threat to our survival than tigers and hurricanes. We know, for instance, that if we go out among other human beings without any pretense, just as we really genuinely are, they are very likely going to turn against us. So the best way to guard against this threat and live a life unburdened by a constant fear of rejection is to play the part of the good person, the socially acceptable person. We know that if we behave according to our culture's version of the truth, then we will be the part of the gang, rather than having to bear the burden of being an outcast. This is actually the reason why most people don't take risks, do the same kind of jobs as most people, follow similar trends, and fancy the same kind of clothes. We are living our lives in incognito mode, hiding our real selves and presenting only what we know others will approve of us. The basic rule of survival in the human world, therefore, is to win the approval of others. The more the number of people who believe in you, the more you value yourself, the more insulated you feel from the prospect of death. By the same token, the less the number of people who believe in you, the less worthy you feel, and the less protected you feel from the threats of life. Unfortunately, this is also how we get stuck in the lifelong game of trying to prove ourselves, trying to be someone that matters, at least in the eyes of others, if not our own. Moreover, if others believing in you gives you a sense of security against death, then taking this game to extreme lengths and becoming a hero in your community, a public figure, a legend, is going to greatly immunize you against the threat that you feel from others. And this is the reason why the idea of being famous and wealthy is so tempting. This is in fact why most of us secretly fashion doing something big, something ambitious and heroic in our lives. We want to matter. We want to leave a mark and be immortalized. We want to evade death forever and keep on living in the minds of others long after we are actually dead. Now you may be wondering, but Rajat, what is wrong with all that? Well, nothing is wrong except the fact that it's hopeless vanity, and it's not grounded in the truth. No matter what you do in this world, one day it will be forgotten for eternity. Even the fact that someone like you ever lived or existed will be wiped out from the hard drives of the universe. And who are you trying to be anyway? Just look at the size of the universe. The only fame you're ever going to get will be in the minds of other human beings, and even they will get old and die. This is the hard truth, but can you accept it? Chances are you probably know that too, but you're in the denial of it because then your whole ambitious project will lose its fervor. Even if you are someone who do not carry such grand ambitions, it is very likely that you do play the hero games on some level or the other. For example, the next time you're in the presence of other people, notice how your behavior changes. Do you laugh more? Do you dress better than you usually dress? Do you talk more about your successes than your failures? Do you try to be more funny? Do you try to make the conversation about the things that you know more about? Do you feel bad when others don't pay attention to you? A lot of people engage in such pretense unconsciously without even realizing it. The thing is that being a hero offers us psychological immunity against the threats that other people pose to our survival. But the trouble with heroism is that you can't be a hero in your own mind. You're only a hero if other people validate your heroism, if they believe in it too. Hence the term cultural heroism. As a result, you have to constantly work to make sure that other people perceive you in the right way. A lot of your time goes in guarding your heroic identity, your public image. This is in fact the reason that your mind is always running, the reason that you're not able to stop thinking. Your mind has learned to be on a perpetual guard, trying to defend you from others. All this just because you want to feel safe. Sadly, there's even a third line of defense against death. The third way we try to bury our awareness of death is through distraction. The thing is that the image that we present to the world in order to play it safe is obviously a lie. But the problem arises when it becomes a habit. As we spend more and more time with others, we get so accustomed to living through this public image that we don't know how to function without it. In the social world, abandoning the public identity is equal to being completely vulnerable to potential threats to survival, just like being naked in front of others. Therefore, the social identity becomes our mental asylum, where we get to feel safe from all the threats. As a result, we don't want to abandon it even when we are not surrounded by anyone. But like we discussed earlier, you can't be a hero in your own mind. You can't get approval for your heroic self from within yourself. You need others to validate the existence of your heroic self. And this is where we get into trouble. This is why we don't feel comfortable in solitude and why so many of us feel lonely. There's a constant push in us towards the social world and away from all things solo. This is also the reason why social media has become so addictive a pastime. It gives you a virtual space where you can still get validation for your identity even if you are physically alone. You get to feel slightly invulnerable against the threats of life just by posting a picture on Instagram. The trouble arises when your identity cannot get approval from external sources. This is when this defense of distraction really comes into play. It will happen to you if you try to be physically alone for a while. You will soon experience discomfort and feel an intense desire to escape that feeling. Feel free to try it if you want to confirm. This is usually when most people turn to other forms of escapes, like watching movies, drinking, smoking, buying stuff, excessive eating, sexual escapes, and excessive sleeping. If you can't get other people to approve of you, and can't get validation for who you believe yourself to be, you're going to feel vulnerable. When that happens, distraction is the only way out for most people. Instead of feeling threatened, instead of letting it in, they will numb their senses by engaging in all sorts of mindless pleasures. To sum up what we have discussed so far, the first line of defense against death is physical comfort. Being physically comfortable fortifies us against the wild and untamed forces of nature that don't give a shit about our survival. The second line of defense against death is cultural heroism. Because our own fellow human beings are a threat to our survival, the best way to guard against such threats is to become a hero within one's culture, to aspire and accomplish the culturally accepted ideals. Being an important and respectable member in our society guards us against the threats that other people pose to our survival. The third line of defense against the threat of death is distraction. Even if we are not able to achieve our culture standard for a respectable citizen, we can avoid feeling threatened by immersing ourselves in mind-numbing pleasures. This alters our consciousness to a degree that we can temporarily feel safe and guarded from all threats. As you can notice from our discussion, what usually passes as life in our culture is actually a hiding from life. All these defenses work together to guard us against the fear of death. This is how we ward off the awareness of our mortality and can afford to live life wastefully, in an artificially created illusion that we still have a long time to live. The very existence of these defenses proved the existence of the fear of death. If there was no lingering fear of death, why defend against it? What are we defending against? Why not live more freely, more courageously? As you have seen so far, the kind of life that we create, overwhelmed by the fear of death, is not much of a life at all. The more we run from death, the more we fortify ourselves against it, the more we withdraw from life too. By the very nature, life is dangerous. The prospect of death is always lingering near. And to deny this danger, this threat, is not living, it's hiding. These defenses that we deploy against death are therefore quite unhealthy and leads to a massive psychological distress that we can easily witness in the world around us. Ironically, the very strategies that we use to bury the awareness of death are killing us from inside out and only moving us closer to death. The answer to our dilemma, therefore, is to unbanish death from the prison of our unconscious and let it surface in our conscious minds. Psychological studies on people on the verge of their death who ended up not dying reveal something amazing. In what they thought was their final days, these people learned to accept their mortal fate and be at peace with it. When they eventually ended up not dying, they reported a complete new outlook on life. They were more present and conscious in their lives without ever meditating. They had less interest in material possessions and were way more courageous in their daily encounters. The question then is, how can we learn to accept and embrace our mortal fates without having to go through a fatal illness or a serious accident? And this brings us to the conclusion of this episode. Contemplating mortality. Mortality is a fact. You will most certainly die without a doubt. But the more inconvenient truth is that you don't know when it is going to happen. Young people, for example, usually feel immune from death. They think that it is something that happens to old people, so as long as they are young, they don't have to worry about death. Well, if you happen to be one of those young people, you will be surprised to know that around 3 million people in the age group of 15 to 34 die each year. That is one young man or woman every 10 seconds. Whatever immunity you feel against death, therefore, is just in your head. Moreover, if we include people of all ages, around 2 people die each second around the world. So from the point when you started listening to this episode, more than 2,000 people around the world have said goodbye to planet Earth. Just wrap your head around this first and understand how fragile this experience of life really is. Do we really have time to be a hero? The way life is presented in our culture is in stark contrast from the way it really is. People out of ignorance are working and saving for their future so that one day they will live. How foolish can they be? The true nature of life is imbued with a sense of urgency, but very few people are able to see life that way. Contemplating our own mortal nature is therefore very helpful in this regard. Here is something you can do. Create a journal where you can time to time reflect your own mortality. Once every week or two, sit alone without any distractions and think about how you would feel if you were to die that very day. Really thoroughly imagine yourself at the brink of death and write down what it feels like. Become aware of the fact that you really have no way of knowing that you cannot die today. Because you don't. The belief in our permanence is an idea that you entertain out of fear. Ask yourself then, what are the things that seem more important from this near-death perspective? Do you feel fear? Do you find it unacceptable to leave life today? Why? Think about whether you feel good about the life you have managed to create so far. What were your best moments? Do you regret not having done something? What do you wish you had done differently? If you leave today, would your presence be missed by anyone? Who do you fear leaving behind? What will happen to the things that you own? Also, realize the fact that soon after you die, your body, the very body you cherish so much, and the face that you look at 100 times in the mirror, will be burned or buried in the ground and have no significance for other people or the world. What do you feel when you think about it? Write all these things down in your journal. The point is to make yourself thoroughly aware and feel it in your bones that life is in fact temporary, that you are temporary. The culture that you and I live in is going to make you forget this due to the defenses that we discuss in this episode. This is why it is very important that we keep resurfacing the fact of our mortality in our consciousness in order to avoid losing the sense of urgency and fearlessness that accompanies it. Just before his death, Gautam Buddha left a last message for the world. So before we part, let me read it to you. All created things are impermanent. Strive with diligence for your liberation.